Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Laurent Binet's new novel, Civilizations, translated from the French by Sam Taylor. This novel came out in France in 2019, and it won the Grand Prix du Roman de l'Académie Française award, which is a pretty prestigious award, and Binet's earlier novels have also won all of the awards in France. And this is kind of how I came to Binet. I haven't read his previous novels, HHhH and The Seventh Function of Language, but I know that he plays a lot with history and fictionality and historiography in particular, which is something that I'm very interested in. And I've heard really good things about The Seventh Function of Language in particular, which is this fictional detective story about the assassination of the literary theorist Roland Barthes. And it includes characters like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, basically all of these very famous French literary theorists of the 1970s and 1980s. And the reason I bring all this up before talking about his new novel, Civilizations, is because I think we can really see where Binet is coming from intellectually by looking at his previous novels. He's clearly well-read in the literary theories of Derrida and Foucault and Barthes. And while I don't really have, honestly, the stomach for a lot of literary theories, it's kind of been beaten out of me in grad school. This sort of postmodern, post-structural approach to literature, but more importantly, history, is fundamental, I think, to understanding Binet and especially his new novel, Civilizations. In fact, while these three men, Derrida, Foucault, and Barthes, are primarily known as literary theorists, their influence in historiography is massive. And in fact, my favorite uses of these literary theorists are always in historiography, not literature. But anyways, what am I getting at? Binet, like the postmodern theorist that he's so well read in, is a deconstructionalist. He recognizes that big ideas in history are constructions. All history is constructed, right? This is kind of fundamental to the work of the famous American historian Hayden White, whose work I particularly really love, and who was very much influenced by theorists like Roland Barthes. Hayden White argues that all history is narrative, and, well, all narrative is constructed, which obviously leads to a very important question. Constructed by whom and for whom? And if it is constructed, well, it can and probably should be also deconstructed. And this is an idea that a lot of people have a lot of problems with. And there are all these accusations of things like revisionist history being thrown around and everything like that. But I promise that if you read historiography and not just history, it makes perfect sense. I'll come back to this at the end in a little bit. But okay, with all of that said, what is this book? Civilizations is a alternative history of the relationship between Europeans and native indigenous Americans throughout history. It reimagines the multiple interactions between these two groups, the indigenous American population and European explorers before the conquest of the Americas. And well, it changes this history. See, in this book, the Incan emperor Atahualpa wasn't captured by Francisco Pizarro, but instead the Incans, led by Atahualpa, sail across the ocean and they conquer Europe. And if this all sounds pretty bizarre, let me just say up front that this book is so much fun. It's really funny and so entertaining that you kind of forget that there's all this really deep and really learned deconstructionalist postmodern theory kind of going on throughout this book. Binet plays with this history, satirizing it and parodying it at times. For example, we get the diary entries of Christopher Columbus, but Christopher Columbus doesn't conquer any of these people. Instead, he's captured by the native populations. And we get this really intimate portrayal of Columbus as this failure, as he's writing back to Ferdinand and Isabella, kind of lamenting his failures. And the only person that will talk to him while he's in prison is this really young girl, and they kind of learn to communicate with each other. Further, once the Incans actually conquer Europe, which does happen, fairly early on in the novel, they have to deal with all of these things that happen in the 16th century, like, say, the Protestant Reformation. But of course, their religion isn't Christian. They have a very different religion. So we get all these really funny, really kind of just hilarious scenes between people like Atahualpa, this Incan emperor, and his interactions with the Pope and people like Martin Luther. And we even get a response to Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which are really quite funny, but they're also really deconstructing the ideologies behind the Protestant Reformation. So this book is funny, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. But that doesn't mean that he's just doing it for fun or just playing a simple, what if game. This book often reads like a parody of the traditional narratives of history, but it's not just parody. It's a revision. There's a deep critique in this book of how we think about history and how we talk about history, how we construct historical narratives. In many ways, this book is just as fictional as the traditional story that Christopher Columbus, in the year 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And then the Pilgrims came and they traded peacefully with the natives, etc. This story that all American school children are taught in grade school. Both of these stories are fictions. Both are constructed narratives. And so this book is really in 4 separate parts, with one part being by far the majority, the part about Atahualpa and the Incans sailing to Europe to conquer them. But the first part is a retelling of the Icelandic Vinland sagas about how medieval Greenlanders and Icelanders, led by Eirik the Red and his son Leif the Lucky, how they sailed to this new land that they named Vinland, which is almost certainly the eastern seaboard of northern Canada, and probably Nova Scotia in particular, as archaeologists have found an 11th century Scandinavian settlement called Lanza Meadows in Nova Scotia. Right, it's 100% clear that these Scandinavian explorers made it to North America and settled there for a little while. And then the next part is in an epistolary style, as we read through the diary entries of Christopher Columbus, nearly 500 years after the Norsemen sailed and attempted to settle in the New World. The third part of this novel is by far the longest, and it's a chronicle of Atahualpa's conquest of Europe. And then the last part is just a few pages, and I don't really want to spoil too much, but it involves Cervantes and Michel de Montaigne, which is quite interesting. But each of these sections are written in a very different style as he mirrors the source material that he's working with. And I want to talk a little bit about the Vinland saga part, because it's the very beginning of the book, and I don't really like spoiling too much of a book in these reviews, but 2, because I love the Vinland sagas. And so I found this part of this book to be one of the most interesting because he adopts the saga style of writing so well, but he doesn't simply retell the story of these Norsemen settling in Vinland, but he expands upon it. This also just reminded me of how badly I really need to read William T. Vollmann's The Ice Shirt, as Vollmann is doing a similar thing to Binet in his 7 Dreams series, though he takes a bit of a different approach. There's also a lot of, interestingly, similarities between the Columbus section of Civilizations and Argall by Vollmann. So perhaps a comparison between these 2 authors and these 2 works would be fruitful, but maybe one day. Anyways, this section that opens up Civilizations about the Vinland sagas follows the journey from Greenland to Vinland, kind of led by Eirik the Red, who gets his nickname, by the way, because, he made a lot of people very red with blood. This is why he needs to find new lands like Greenland. But he has a daughter named Freydis Eiríksdóttir, and she's one of the leaders of this journey in both the original saga and in Civilizations, where she really takes center stage. And we get this introduction of her. Nothing is known about Freydis' mother, but Freydis, like her brothers, inherited her father's Eirik's wanderlust. So it was that she embarked on the ship lent by her half-brother Leif the Lucky to Thorfinn Karlsefni, so they could find the way to Vinland. They sailed west. After a stopover in Markland, they reached Vinland and found the camp left behind by Leif Erikson. They found it a beautiful land, with forests not far from the sea and white sand along the coastline. There were many islands and shallows. Day and night were of more equal length than in Greenland or Iceland. But there were also skrælings there, beings that resembled small trolls. The legends were wrong. They were not unipeds, but they had dark skin and were fond of red fabrics. So this very dry and chronicle-like style is very reminiscent of the saga style of writing in the Vinland sagas. And it's effectively mirrored here. But here, we immediately meet these natives, these skrælings. And this follows both of the Vinland sagas very accurately. And the Vinland sagas are 2 separate sagas by the way. There's Eirik saga, rauða, Eirik the Red saga, and Grønlendingasögur, the saga of the Greenlanders. And they both retell this same story with slight modifications, which is also quite interesting because Binet also retells this exact same story with perhaps a bit larger of modifications. But in Civilizations, there's this reference, to the Unipeds, which exist in, I believe it's Eirik the Red saga. I always get the Greenlander saga and Eirik the Red saga mixed up. But in Eirik the Red saga, there is this Uniped who is wandering around in this new land in Vinland in North America, and he shoots one of these Norsemen. The Uniped in Old Norse is called Einfættiga maður, a one-footed man. But so in the saga, Vinland is this kind of quasi-magical place, right? Because it's on the edge of the known world, right? And monsters dwell on the edge of the world, right? This is where others exist. So in Civilizations and in the Vinland sagas, they meet the locals, who the text calls Skrælingars, which is the same word in Old Norse, which is usually left untranslated, mainly because we're actually not sure where the etymology comes from. It might refer to their skin color or the clothing that they wear, but we're not exactly sure where the word comes from. And these two groups begin trading a little bit, and then they come to blows, as people seem to do, right? And they have these battles, and in the sagas, these battles do have these magical elements to them. There's this bowl that they have that the natives use to fight, and they also have these like horns that they use that make these really loud booming sounds. But all this is to say that these magical elements, if you've read the sagas of the Icelanders, right, the family sagas, magical elements don't really appear too much in the family sagas. So it's actually quite rare, which makes it quite interesting because, again, Vinland is on the edge of the world, and so there is a little bit of magic there to be had. But so I'm quickly paraphrasing. Eventually, the Vinland settlement does fail, and the Norsemen pack up shop and sail back to Greenland and to Iceland. But before they leave, Freydis Eiríksdóttir does give birth to a boy on North American soil, essentially. So he's kind of the first European to be born in the Americas. His name is Snorri. But eventually they do pack up and leave, and they never come back. And we don't know why they never come back. But this legend of this Vinland journey stays with Greenlanders and Icelanders for generations. I mean, the sagas, the Vinland sagas, are written well over 250 years after this journey took place, which indicates that these people and this journey were talked about for generations, right? And this history of this settlement remains to this day politically and culturally important, which is why Binet is writing about it. And let's be clear, this voyage is historically accurate, right? The Norsemen did 100% settle in Nova Scotia at this place called, or what will become Nova Scotia, at this place that we now call Lanza Meadows. We have archaeological evidence of this. It's completely clear. For a long time, people were unsure whether or not to believe this story, or if Vinland was in North America, or if it was just like a part of Greenland or something like that. It's 100% North America. But it didn't last, and the language that we use to talk about this settlement is important, right? That is, like discussions of Christopher Columbus and his so-called discovery of North America, the political ramifications of the Norse settlement are important. I mean, it seems like we can't go a year before someone, discovers rune stones somewhere on the eastern seaboard or in Minnesota, where there are a lot of Scandinavian, a lot of descendants of Scandinavian immigrants. And these rune stones, by the way, are all 100% fake, unequivocally. But people want to believe that the Vikings explored a lot of this continent because it helps them lay some sort of claim to it. There's even this really famous map called the Vinland Map, which is currently actually held at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. And this map purports to be a 15th century Scandinavian map that shows Vinland. It shows the eastern seaboard of North America. And thus, this map proves that the sailors explored this whole region. This map is clearly a fake, right? Anyone who knows medieval maps knows that this map is a fake, even though it wasn't until I think like 2 or 3 months ago that Yale University finally came out officially and acknowledged that the map is a forgery, is a fake. But its forgery shows, I think, that people want to believe this narrative. They want to believe that these, again, Viking, I'm using that word, they weren't Vikings. Viking is a profession, not a people. That these Scandinavian explorers explored a lot of North America 1,000 years ago. Further, I mean, we even have Leif Erikson Day here in the States. It's actually today, as I record this, on October 9th, where, you know, every year the president of the United States gives this, like, he publishes like this weird proclamation celebrating this voyage. It's kind of bizarre. But in Civilizations, this narrative that these Norsemen explored the eastern seaboard of the United States is not only true, but they make it all the way down to Mexico, right? They sail the entire eastern seaboard. They go and hang out at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. They hang out in Cuba for a bit, and they really integrate with the natives. They marry each other and introduce the natives to the Norse gods. And they build temples to Thor, who joins the natives' pantheon of gods. And they also introduce the natives to iron weapons, as Norsemen were very good iron workers and blacksmiths. And the natives introduced the Norsemen to all these different ideas and thoughts and all this different stuff. But the Norsemen also introduced the natives to diseases. And a lot of the natives do die. And there's really interesting passages where the Norsemen don't actually know what to do, and they think that they should leave because all the natives around them are dying from these diseases. But this is important for the conception of Binet's book, because this early introduction to these diseases helps make the descendants of these indigenous people more impervious to these diseases when 500 years later, Christopher Columbus comes. And this is where this narrative jumps ahead, 500 years to these European explorers coming to North America in the late 15th century. And so you're probably thinking the same kind of questions that I was thinking while reading this. Why? What's the point of all of this? Why create this alternative history, this fake history? And honestly, I don't really have a single reason for this. I think there's a lot of different reasons that people can posit. But I think I do have some thoughts. Like Philip Roth in his The Plot Against America, which kind of reimagines what would have happened in the 1940s if FDR lost the presidency and anti-Semitism kind of became the hegemonic power in the United States as it did in Germany. It's worth teasing out these historic potentialities because it helps readers explore what could have happened. History is a series of coincidences in which random acts collide and create, well, us. That is, history is often about luck or chance. We don't really know why the Greenlanders decided to abandon their settlement in Vinland. They very well could have stayed and integrated with the natives or the indigenous population. Christopher Columbus could have been captured by the indigenous people, and Atahualpa could have escaped capture by Pizarro and have defeated Pizarro. The fact that any of these things could have happened make any sort of teleological argument about, say, the myth of the West kind of asinine, as it's in part due to chance that it happened the way that it did. It's clearly not because of Western superiority or ideas of manifest destiny or something like that, that it ended up working out this way. In fact, it's more about the power of these stories or the ideas and things like that, which then, in retrospect, create this history, create these narratives. We go back and impose narratives on the randomness of history. History requires revision because it's not perfect and objective, right? As much as people like to think. I have so many students who every year come into class and they associate history with objectivity and English or literature with subjectivity. But any halfway decent historian has to use the same critical eye while they while they read history that they would while they're reading fictional literature. What's interesting here in Civilizations is that there is a semblance of historical fact. This book takes historically verifiable figures, dates, and events, but of course he skews all of these things and he introduces all of this fiction to this. He takes the historical diaries of Christopher Columbus, a document that is incredibly important for anyone who wants to kind of understand the late 15th century and the beginnings of the age of exploration, but he messes with it. And it's really difficult sometimes to tell what Binet made up and what he is drawing from his sources. Right? Even in the account of the Vinland sagas, which I'm very familiar with, there are moments where I wasn't sure if he was referencing something in the saga or the historical or archaeological record, or if he was simply making it up. But that's kind of the point. Civilizations is a really fun book that's really just enjoyable to read. But more importantly, it's a book that makes you question the idea of historical objectivity. It makes you think about the narratives of history, the constructedness of history, and history as a discipline, which is something that I think we really need right now, as people like to think that history is set in stone, occasionally literally. But this really isn't the case. History and the narrative of history have always been political constructions. In the words of James M. Banner Jr. in this fantastic book, which came out just earlier this year, The Ever-Changing Past, Why All History is Revisionist History. He writes, "All historians are revisionists, at least in some respects. They are always trying to get a grasp on the past, not only for their simple need and desire to understand that past, and for the pleasures and satisfaction such understanding may bring them, but also for their visions and hopes. Thus all works of history should be approached as presumptively revisionist. Yet calling a history revisionist, or more recently, neo-revisionist, is like calling water wet. The use of the term speaks to what is inherent in historical writing, not what is distinctive about any example of it. Since historians always have some purpose in writing their histories, written history is always intentional, an effort to understand and present a rendering of a subject more complete than previous historians' understanding of it, and thus different from what was previously understood. That is, since every historian, by virtue of possessing a distinct mind, disposition, perspective, and purpose, offers a particular take on a subject or issue that, by the very fact of existing, is a unique expression of that historian. All historians come to their work with the aim of bringing their own selves and no one else's to bear on the subject at hand." Binet just does this to the extreme and, well, absurd end, as postmodernists tend to do. Binet has written a really intelligent book that postmodernizes the interactions between Europeans and the indigenous populations of the Americas. I think someone with a better understanding of post-structuralism and postmodern literary theories would be able to get a bit more out of this book, as it's clear that Binet is heavily drawing from these theories. But I don't think you need a full understanding of these ideas to get what Binet is doing here. But let me know what you think. I'd be interested to see if anyone else has read this new Binet novel. I think I've seen a few reviews floating around of The Seventh Function of Language, but I haven't seen much talk of Binet outside of that. And I'd be interested to know what you all think of him. But for now, thanks for watching.